Just before the Hebrews began to enter Palestine, their earlier desert religion, centered on patriarchal family worship, underwent a profound transformation. According to Hebrew tradition, this change was the result of the teachings of a great leader named Moses. At one time, scholars doubted whether such a transformation could be attributed to a single individual. More recently, however, the traditional view that Moses played a central role has regained scholarly support. As a result of Moses' teachings, the tribal god of the Hebrews acquired a permanent and personal name, Yahweh, often translated as I am that I am, or I cause to be what is. This name emphasized him as the creator, not merely a local or tribal deity. Although he retained characteristics of a storm god associated with mountaintops and warfare, his role became far more significant. Central to Moses' teaching was the idea of a covenant, or contract, between God and the Hebrews. For the first time, the Hebrews understood themselves not merely as a family or a group of tribes, but as a people bound together by a national relationship with a single God. He promised to protect them, grant them land, and help them overcome their enemies. In return, the Hebrews were to recognize him as their only God, obey his commands, and reject all others. What distinguished this covenant from earlier contractual religions was its ethical dimension. In earlier religions, divine rules focused primarily on ritual and ceremony. Under Moses, the Hebrews were required to live moral and ethical lives, as laid out most clearly in the Ten Commandments. These laws regulated human relationships, prohibiting murder, theft, false testimony, and injustice, rather than simply prescribing religious rituals. Importantly, this covenant applied only to the Hebrews. They alone were bound by it, and their reward was not salvation in another world, but success in this one, especially victory over enemies and possession of land. It is often said that Moses introduced monotheism, but this is not entirely clear. Moses was primarily concerned with how the Hebrews behaved toward God. Whether other gods existed was largely irrelevant. What mattered was that the Hebrews worshipped only God. This position is better described as monolatry, the exclusive worship of one God, rather than philosophical monotheism. Some scholars have suggested that Moses may have been influenced by religious ideas from Egypt, where movements toward ethical religious thought and even monotheism had appeared during the New Kingdom. The name Moses itself is Egyptian. However, Egyptian ethics were not as tightly bound to divine command as Hebrew ethics, and it remains unclear whether Moses adopted these ideas directly. The most distinctive element of Hebrew religion, the exclusive covenant binding one God to one people, clearly developed out of earlier Hebrew tradition. The Old Testament attributes the foundation of Hebrew religious organization to the time of Moses, marking the beginning of what we now call Judaism. While this attribution is uncertain, it is clear that a fully developed religious hierarchy did not emerge until much later, especially after the establishment of the Hebrew monarchy. Before the founding of the kingdom around 1000 BCE, Hebrew religious practice was simple and decentralized. During their nomadic period, religious observances were conducted by patriarchs and family leaders who offered occasional animal sacrifices. There were few formal rituals and no permanent priesthood. When the 12 Hebrew tribes united to invade and settle Palestine, a more formal religious structure became necessary. Religion served as the primary bond holding the tribes together. A religious center was established at Shiloh in central Palestine, which functioned as the spiritual, not political, capital. It housed the Ark of the Covenant, along with other sacred objects, and was overseen by a high priest. According to tradition, the priesthood had been founded by Moses and descended from Aaron, his brother. Members of this priesthood were drawn from a single tribe, the Levites, although this rule was not always strictly observed. Despite the existence of a high priest, religious officials played a relatively minor role until the creation of the monarchy. This changed under David, who began establishing a formal state administration. Religious institutions grew alongside political ones. It was under Solomon that this process reached its fullest development. Solomon built the Great Temple in Jerusalem, uniting religious worship with the political capital. He expanded the priesthood, assigned scribes and assistants to maintain records and preserve sacred writings, and developed more elaborate rituals and ceremonies. Solomon also attempted to make Judaism more acceptable to non-Hebrews within his kingdom and to his foreign wives. To do this, he adopted certain symbols and practices from older Canaanite fertility religions. These changes were deeply unpopular with conservative Hebrews who saw them as betrayals of the covenant. Despite controversy, the work of the priests was historically significant. They expanded the law, formalized religious practice, and ensured that religion shaped every aspect of daily life. This helped preserve a distinct Hebrew identity, even after the Hebrew state itself ceased to exist. At the same time, the increasing emphasis on ritual and ceremony threatened to turn Hebrew religion into yet another rigid system of formal worship. Almost immediately, this provoked a powerful reaction among those who sought to preserve the original moral and spiritual core of the faith. This reaction is known as the prophetic movement, and it is to that movement and its lasting impact on world history that we now turn. The prophetic movement was led by individuals known as prophets, but to understand their role, we first need to clarify what prophecy meant in the ancient Near East. Throughout the ancient Near Eastern world, there was a long tradition of individuals who believed they could establish direct contact with the gods. Some sought this contact through contemplation, ecstatic rituals, music, dancing, or the use of mind-altering substances. In other cases, it was believed to occur spontaneously. These individuals were thought to receive divine messages, and at times insight into the future by learning the intentions of the gods. The Hebrews shared this belief. They held that certain men, and occasionally women, received special messages from God. Moses was regarded as the greatest of these figures. Before the establishment of the Hebrew monarchy, many Hebrews believed their ideal leaders were such divinely inspired individuals rather than kings. The creation of the monarchy changed this situation. Once the kingdom was established, a new group of religious figures emerged alongside kings and priests. These figures are known to us as prophets. In Hebrew, they were called Nabi, meaning one who is called, that is, one called by God to speak on his behalf. In most other Near Eastern societies, such as Mesopotamia, it was the king and the priesthood who interpreted the will of the gods for the people. In Israel, however, religion was grounded in sacred texts and a covenant against which human behavior, including the behavior of kings, could be judged. This gave Hebrew prophets a unique role. Because the law and covenant were considered divinely revealed, prophets were able to criticize the state openly. When kings or people violated the covenant, prophets could denounce them, not as political rebels, but as messengers of God. Whenever the Hebrews strayed from God or abandoned the ethical requirements of the covenant, prophets appeared to call them back. Political and military disasters were interpreted not as random events, but as signs of God's displeasure. Defeats, invasions, and economic suffering were understood as consequences of injustice, idolatry, and moral failure. The most famous prophets emerged just before or during times of national catastrophe. Amos, preaching around 750 BCE, warned the northern kingdom of Israel that social injustice and religious hypocrisy would bring destruction. Jeremiah, prophesying around 600 BCE, interpreted the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the kingdom of Judah as a direct result of covenantal failure. After the Hebrew state itself was destroyed, later prophets played a crucial role in preserving Jewish identity. Instead of promising immediate political restoration, they taught that God's plan had not ended. They spoke of a future Messiah, a divinely appointed deliverer who would one day restore Israel. In this way, the prophetic tradition kept Jewish hope and religious cohesion alive despite exile, defeat, and suffering. Through their preaching, the prophets preserved and expanded the central features of Judaism, especially its ethical focus and its evolving conception of God. Early Hebrews had not necessarily believed that God was the only God in existence. Rather, they believed that He was their God alone, the only God they were permitted to worship. This form of belief is best described as monolatry, the exclusive worship of one God without denying the existence of others. Over time, however, and especially as suffering increased following the Assyrian conquest of Israel, the prophets began to insist on something more radical: that God was not merely Israel's God, but the only God anywhere. This conviction transformed Hebrew religion into true monotheism, In this view, God was no longer tied to a single land or political state. He ruled all nations and used history itself as a tool to enforce justice. Even Israel's suffering was reinterpreted as evidence not of divine weakness, but of divine power and moral purpose. The prophetic movement fundamentally reshaped world history. It introduced the idea that political power is morally accountable, that divine authority demands ethical behavior, and that suffering has moral meaning rather than being random or meaningless. These ideas would later influence Christianity and Islam, as well as Western concepts of justice, law, and social responsibility. Thus, although the Hebrews were never a dominant political power, their prophets helped create a religious and ethical tradition that would outlast empires and continue to shape the modern world.